Hi everybody, welcome to Aimee Nolte Music. I promised you a follow-up video for my 50 Essential Jazz Albums video that I made last week. It needs a follow-up video because there are a lot of things I want to explain to you about my process of coming up with that list. Thank you everybody who watched it and shared it and commented on it. I always appreciate that. All right, so here are the things that I want to say. I want to say first of all that the first 5 albums on the list are not albums at all, but compilations of recordings of the first 5 artists that I listed. And it's because that up until about 1949, the LP as we know it today didn't really exist yet. So all of those early recordings, they were just out there kind of on their own, maybe not really a part of an album like we know it today. Louis Armstrong shows up on the first 2 compilations. He plays with King Oliver's band, and then he plays with his own Hot 5 and Hot 7 bands. And I want it to be noted that Lil Hardin, who was his second wife, was the piano player for many of those Hot 5 recordings. She's one of the first female American piano players to really make a name for herself. I don't think anybody would really dispute my addition of any of these early pioneers of jazz. But they might ask why other people weren't included, and well, that kind of brings me to my explanation about how I put this list together. My first step was to get on my Facebook music page because I have over 5,000 followers, thank you, and I wanted to get their opinions about who they thought should be included. I asked them to tell me their favorites and to list them one at a time, and that everybody that agreed with them could like their suggestions so that I'd get kind of a tally or votes, of who wanted what. By doing this, I was able to start my list pretty easily. The next thing I did was to start checking the web to see other top 10 lists, top 100 lists, and to kind of cross-reference those with my Facebook poll to see which ones were showing up everywhere. There's a lot of instances, both on the lists on the internet and in my poll, where there are several albums listed for the same artist. Miles Davis, John Coltrane, Hank Mobley, Herbie Hancock, Bill Evans. In those cases, I did my best to research which albums sold the best, which ones were included on important lists, and which ones were kind of considered to be quintessential or definitive by jazz writers and magazines. I even visited some subreddit threads of fan pages of some of these artists, and I posted anonymously to see what people thought, and that was pretty helpful too, although it should be noted that there are a lot of boneheads on Reddit. Especially in the instance of Duke Ellington, however, I found some of those opinions quite helpful. I found enough consensus across the interwebs to come to the conclusion that Ellington at Newport should be the Ellington album on my list, but it's one that I wrestled with a lot. All I can say is that I decided in the end that my list's purpose was just to give a taste of what's out there and what built this music to people who were looking for some guidance but just didn't know where to start. Even though it's got its flaws, I'd like to think that it accomplished that. And I want you to know too that just because I happen to choose this one album of Duke Ellington, it doesn't mean that it's, that I think it should be your favorite album, or that it's even my favorite album, or that you shouldn't dive deep into the Duke's music to find what you love. If I were to pick my favorites, I would probably go to the solo piano playing of Duke Ellington or his recording with John Coltrane. Like, those are my favorites. My favorites. That brings me to another point. How often did my opinion, like my personal taste, influence this list? I tried not to let it, but I think in the end, a few times it did. For instance, if I was going to tell you my favorite Sarah Vaughan recording, I would choose Live in Japan. That's my favorite by far. But when I was researching, I found enough critics and writers that kind of hailed her album with Clifford Brown as her best work. And it was high in my Facebook poll also. So it made the list. Even the most critical review that I could find about this album actually explained perfectly what I love about Sassy, as she was called. I'm gonna read it to you. It's from Ben Ratliff of the New York Times. He said that at times Vaughn rockets between hoity-toity and an earthy blues singer in lower register moments. Sometimes she approaches vulgarity. Tell him, Ben, that's it. Maybe some people wouldn't have included Django Reinhardt, but I adore Django Reinhardt's playing. I feel like if I would have left him out, there would have been a huge void at the beginning of jazz guitar. My heart aches that I didn't include Ben Webster, Lester Young, Coleman Hawkins, who were all the first innovators of the tenor saxophone. And while I'm at it, I need to mention Pepper Adams and Jerry Mulligan, Jimmy Heath, Yusef Lateef, Dexter Gordon, George Coleman, Eddie Lockjaw Davis. So many other great saxophone players that you should definitely check out. I can't do that with every instrument. I wish I could, but I can't name all of the players from every instrument that I left out, but you've got to know that I was thinking about them. And anyway, I think this video will be long enough as it is, but I can ask that you do some research and figure out which ones are not on the list so you can find out which ones speak to you. I think that's what music is about anyway, just finding what speaks to you. I also need to briefly mention that one of the factors for me putting this list together was personnel. So the fact that Dizzy Gillespie shows up on the Quintet album, that was enough for me not to give Dizzy Gillespie his own album, and the same with Bud Powell. And I absolutely do think that each of them deserved their own spot, but something had to give. Max Roach appears more than once as a sideman, as does Clark Terry, Tommy Flanagan, Charles Mingus, Paul Chambers, many more. Also the fact that the trio, Red Garland and Philly Joe Jones and Paul Chambers, the fact that they played on the Art Pepper album that's on the list made it easier for me to decide that maybe I wouldn't include the Miles Davis albums that they do appear on, which also are my favorite. Bill Evans was one that I actually needed to go back to Facebook and take a second poll about. There were so many albums mentioned. Well, I think I just have too many piano players following me, but there were so many of his albums mentioned that were hard for me, to decide between, like Explorations and Portrait in Jazz and Duets with Myself, You Must Believe in Spring. But I felt in the end that the Village Vanguard recordings would be maybe the most important, especially because they included more than one recording date and because they included Scott LaFaro, who we lost just days after those recordings. And I think that his bass playing was just an integral part to that sound. I know that I neglected Joe Henderson, and I really wanted to put The Inner Urge as one of the albums, but the fact that Joe Henderson shows up on The Sidewinder with Lee Morgan and also The Real McCoy with McCoy Tyner helped me to ixnay The Inner Urge, and I feel badly about that one. My heart also broke when I had to take Nina Simone off the list, and just so you know, she would be number 51, I guess. Listen to Nina Simone. I also debated about whether to include Latin jazz. I thought about Arturo Sandoval, I thought about Tito Puente and Pancho Sanchez, but I thought, if I do one, how can I only do one? And this is probably a video for another day, probably made by someone who has more knowledge about Latin jazz than I do. I should probably also just say that, just for sentimental reasons, that A Love Supreme is my favorite album of all time. So much so that all 4 of my children were born while it played in the background. Maybe I should say that the other way around. When my children were born, it was being played in the background. It's secondary to the fact that they were born, right? But John Coltrane is one of my great heroes, so I'm happy to see him on the list 3 times, and, well, I can't put him on more than that, but if you love John Coltrane, don't forget to explore his later albums. Live at the Village Vanguard really, really gets at the heart of who he was just shortly before he passed away. When I got to the 1970s and beyond, I really had a hard time. One of my goals from the outset of this list was to not be like the Ken Burns jazz documentary that basically neglected all of that time. And even, from the 60s on, I felt like it just, left out half of jazz. But in a way, I feel like I kind of ended up doing that. And it's because by the time I got to 1970, I think I had like 40 already, something like that. Really, it's just because my number wasn't big enough. Maybe I should have gone with like 75, but I didn't want to overwhelm people who are beginners And I have to think about my YouTube title and thumbnail, and 50 just kind of seemed like a tidy number to me. When I got to the 1970s, though, I just started cutting people left and right. That was awful. John McLaughlin, so important to the development of jazz guitar, doesn't get his own album, but he appeared on Miles Davis's Bitches Brew, so I let that one go. Jaco Pastorius is just central to the world of bass guitar. He's on the Heavy Weather album, so that sufficed. I had to drop John Scofield altogether, who actually just came out with a brand new album. You should check that out. It's amazing. It was also really hard for me to decide about Keith Jarrett because every list that I checked had the Cologne Concert as being the definitive Keith Jarrett album. And even my Facebook poll that had the highest number of votes. So I included it, but if we were talking about me, I would tell you that At the Deerhead Inn and Live in Norway are my very favorite Keith Jarrett albums. I didn't get to add Maria Schneider either, and I really wanted to add her Evanescence album, as well as Carla Bley. She's another one that I thought about. Choosing a Michael Brecker album was not easy. Leaving off Bob Mintzer, Joanne Brackeen, Dave Liebman, The Marsalises, Stanley Jordan, Jerry Allen, Phil Woods, Mulgrew Miller, Dave Holland, Charlie Hayden, Mike Stern, Marcus Roberts, Terrence Blanchard, Fred Hirsch, Joe Lovano, Kenny Garrett, Kenny Burrell, Kenny Barron, Andrew Hill, Roy Hargrove, Bill Frisell, Kurt Rosenwinkel, Diane Reeves, Esperanza Spalding, Gregory Porter. I reeled off all those names because I just didn't want you to feel like jazz dropped off the face of the earth in 1980, because it totally didn't. I just couldn't justify knocking somebody else off of the list once I got to that point. And maybe you could have done it, but I don't know. I just didn't. I'm sorry. It is what it is. And I hope you can see that for me, it was a labor of love, but also a daunting task. It took me months and months. And I don't pretend to think that I'm the person who should be the one to make a list like this at all, but I had enough requests for it and also a large enough YouTube following at this point that I felt like it might make a difference. And just saying the name of every single person that I've mentioned in this video and on my list makes my heart do a little flip when I remember the effect that all of them have had on my life. I hope that you'll dig deep and listen with focus as you try to discover who your jazz heroes are. Thanks everybody for watching. I'll see you next time on Aimee Nolte Music.